Yeah, thanks. I really want to thank the organizers first, Bruce and Matt and Stephen. You guys have created just this really welcoming space for people from all different backgrounds with all different skill levels. And I know I've really got a lot out of coming to these meetups, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one. So thanks a lot for doing this. And if I look to the side, it's because I put all your faces on the side, and it's a little weird to not be looking at you in the face. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the iWildCam 2020 competition today, where the goal was to automatically identify species in camera trap images. So just to kind of let you know where we're going, I'll tell you my introduction, and then a bit about the competition and the types of data that they used. We'll walk through a comparison of the solutions of some of the top teams and do a little side detour to talk about EfficientNet, which a lot of the teams used. And then at the end, we'll talk about some of the surprises and the things that the organizers learned from the competition, some things they're thinking about doing for future competitions. And then at the end, there's just like a list of further information. We can have a little bit of discussion. Throughout the whole thing, I would love it, just jump in and ask questions if you have them, or if you have extra insight into something, feel free to leap in. Hopefully this will be less me talking to you for the next 45 minutes or however long, and more of a conversation. Oh, and also I think the slides are going to go online at some point. And so if you are interested in this topic, I've put hyperlinks throughout the presentation. So you'll see some underlined text, and that's just partly for my own organization and partly for if someone is interested, the slides will be online and you can go and look up some more information. So I'm Heather. Hello. My background is in academic research. So I've done some different projects combining animals, math, and programming. I've done some image segmentation on animal nerves and on kidneys to look at the blood flow synchronization in the kidney. I've done some statistical analysis of jaw shape in fish to look at questions about evolution, and dabbled in some machine learning to automatically identify eagle behaviors from nest cams in bald eagle nests. Right now, I'm looking to move into a more applied field. Specifically, I'm looking into using data analysis for conservation or for agriculture. So if anyone has a background in that or knows about some interesting projects that are going on right now, please feel free to contact me. I'm also job hunting right now. So if you know of a very cool opportunity that I should be looking at, please extra feel free to contact me. And you can also go to my website if you forget my email, or message me on Meetup. I think that is an option. Right, so the competition that I'm going to talk about today is the iWildCam 2020 competition. This was part of a workshop that took place at a conference last year. So the conference was on computer vision and pattern recognition, and this one-day workshop was on fine-grained visual categorization. So that's sort of between object recognition, like this is a table, this is a chair, and identifying like individuals, like facial recognitions, like that's Matt, that's Bruce. So in the middle, there's this fine-grained visual categorization where you can say like, yes, this is a dog and it's this species of dog. So it's some sort of level in the middle between those. So previously, this workshop had run before in 2018 and 2019, and every iteration of they also had Kaggle competitions, and every iteration kind of built on the last one. So in 2018, the goal was just to identify whether or not there was an animal in a camera trap image, and I'll talk a bit about what camera trap images are in a bit. In 2019, you should identify the species of the animal, and they added some extra modalities of data that the participants could use. And in both of those were limited to North American locations. So in 2020, they expanded the locations to include worldwide locations. Participants should identify the species in the camera trap images. You don't have to say a probability, but just identify the species. And the organizers included some other types of data that they hadn't for the previous competitions to see if that would help. They selected the winners from the top 10 entrants on Kaggle. One was high score and one was novel contribution. I don't have confirmation of who the winners were. I guess they probably just announced it at their workshop. But, that's what they did. The organizers of the workshop were from Caltech and Microsoft AI for Earth. The data was from Wildlife Conservation Society, which is a worldwide conservation Society. I guess that's kind of obvious. The workshop is also supported by Google and Wildlife Insights and Lila BC. And Wildlife Insights and Lila BC are sort of repositories of camera trap and other wildlife image data. So camera traps. Camera traps are motion-triggered cameras that are placed in the wild. This is one that I saw at Golden Ears when I was hiking last fall. It's from a research group from UBC. And what it is, it's a camera, and it's motion activated, usually with an infrared sensor, but sometimes with a heat sensor. And then when it's motion activated, it takes either a single photograph or a series of them, depending on the settings that you program into the camera. They can, in general, take images both during the day, like these nice bears, or at night using an infrared flash, or you can also get ones that use a regular flash, but the infrared is usually less disturbing to the animals, so choose that. They're pretty cool because they're relatively cheap and labor effective relative to just sending a researcher out to sit in the forest and take pictures of the animals they see. You can buy a camera trap for between $200 to $800, which is much less than you need to pay someone to do that, especially if it's Antarctica or something. And you can leave it there for quite a long time. So you can end up collecting a lot of data over a long period of time. You're really only limited by the size of the SD card that you put into the camera, which is essentially these days unlimited, and the battery life, which can be, I think the longest one that I saw was 10 months. So you can really leave them out there for a while. They're also really great because they capture natural animal behavior. The animals won't smell or see a person, and so they'll just continue doing their natural behaviors. So because of these benefits, camera traps are really widely used. Thousands of organizations use them, and it's estimated that there are hundreds of millions of images generated every year from these camera traps. But to manually analyze all of those images would take a really long time. So this is an ideal candidate for automatic identification, for example, with machine learning. Great. Any questions so far? Right.
Just a random one.
Yeah, love it. Random are the best ones.
The images for this competition, were they obtained from any particular one of the thousands of organizations, or were they like a collaborative effort?
Yes, I think that might be one of my next few slides. They were all from Wildlife Conservation Society. So they just provided all of the images. So I guess it's from one organization, unless they collaborate with other ones. I'm not really sure.
I have a quick question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Adam.
Maybe this isn't too important, but in the picture of the camera trap, what are all the different black octagons? Are those all different lenses?
Oh, that's such a good question. I am not sure. In my head, and I don't know if this is true, this is just what I've been thinking, it's just like a way to protect what's underneath it from, like, if an animal starts to, like, because sometimes animals go after camera traps and they'll like rip them off the tree. There are camera traps that have been destroyed by bears and stuff. So I don't know that each of the black octagons is an individual thing, but it might just be something.
I think I know the answer to this. I think that those are the infrared lights that are used to light the scene. And it's called black infrared, which is kind of a weird term, but because they're not visible to the animals, and I guess you need a lot of them to get enough illumination.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, and the lens really looks like what's got the lens hood over it in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that would make the bottom bit the sensor, right?
That's the motion sensor at the bottom. Yeah. Yeah, what I was going to say was I used to have a camera sort of like this, not as fancy as this one, and then it kind of wrecked, and I tried to get another one. And it was going to be so great because it actually had a cell data card in it, and I wouldn't have to go to the camera because we back onto a forest, and there's lots of interesting wildlife back there. So if you have a recommendation for what's a good one to get for a hobbyist.
You know what? I actually do.
Yeah?
Which slide of this? So at the bottom of this slide.
TrailCam
right
Pro?
Yeah. So they just sound like the coolest company. Like they're American. So I don't know if that influences if you'd purchase something from them. But you can call them up and they'll help you choose something, and they have a load of comparisons on their website. The cheapest one that I saw, I have a picture of it in my notes, but I decided not to put it in the presentation. It's like $250 and it sends to your cell. So
awesome. Okay.
Yeah. So I would visit TrailCam Pro because like I kind of want to work for them a little bit. They just sound amazing. Read their stuff. And they have comparisons of all the different cameras. They do testing on them. And so you can see sample images from all the cameras, and they do comparisons and they rate them on all these different metrics. It's a data dream. Their website is amazing.
Oh, cool. Hey, they're probably looking for a Canadian distributor. I'm sure they can do that.
There you go. Right. Any more? Okay. So camera traps are pretty cool. They have a lot of benefits, but in order to automatically identify the images coming out of camera traps, it's not super easy. Animals are not always easy to identify. They move, so they might be out of focus because the animals are moving or because the camera didn't focus correctly. The animal may not be lit very well. It might be at night and the flash didn't reach it, or it might be during the day and they have a lot of sun glaring on them. The animal could be very far from the camera and barely show up at all. It could just be like a little dot, or it could be really close to the camera and you only get a small part of the animal showing up. There can be obstructions between the camera and the animal. In this example, weeds grew in front of the camera, so now all the animals passing in front of it are obstructed. And a lot of the times the camera takes a picture and there's no animal in it because they're motion activated. So even like a leaf moving or a tree moving will activate the camera to take a picture. And so on average, it's about 70% of images that coming out of the camera traps don't even have anything in them. Besides these things, the characteristics, like the overall characteristics of the image can be different. Different seasons change the background. So these are 3 images from the same camera in 3 different seasons. Weather can affect it. It could snow, it could rain. Snow could also could activate the motion sensor. And sometimes the cameras, they just malfunction and you get these really funky colors and it just looks weird. So whatever algorithm you come up with to automatically identify these camera trap images needs to be able to take these factors into account.
Oh, another question here, actually.
Oh.
Like I was wondering, you configure the cameras when you set them up. So is the sensitivity, like how much motion they detect before they're triggered, is that one of the things that you can like configure?
I don't know.
The one that we had,
TrailCam Pro would know.
The one that we had, you had a couple of options, but not very many. There, maybe the fancier ones you have more control, but it was really just you get what you get. And I'm a little surprised by so many of these pictures being spoiled by motion because it's a combination of motion and the infrared signature that would trigger it. So we didn't have that many false positives in the pictures that we were getting. Yeah.
You mentioned that only some of them have like the infrared sensors on them, though.
Oh, maybe they do.
I believe it's the most common one.
Okay.
But it could, or maybe Bruce just got a high-end one. I don't know.
It was a, fairly consumer-oriented version of these things. Yeah. I mean, infrared's pretty cheap, actually. Yeah. Okay. I think they just throw it in there.
Do you know what yours was meant for,
Oh, it was meant for exactly what we were doing. You strap it on a tree and just, hunters like them and conservationists and things like that. Or sometimes people who own like a big property, they just want to know what kind of wildlife is roaming around. That sort of stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you happen to know like roughly what percentage of the photos are good versus bad? Like how many of them, is a large percentage problematic? I couldn't just.
This I don't know. I'm not sure. Do you mean in this data set or in general?
Yeah. Like, yeah, if you were to try to apply this sort of problem and given this data, like if you wanted to focus on just the sort of ideal photos for training, like what would that leave you with?
I'm not sure. That's a really good question.
Probably not much, or they would do that. But I was just curious if like you knew the numbers. So
I think in general, it would really depend on the location of the camera trap and what you were hoping to get out of it. I know some of the images that I saw, I didn't download the whole data set, but I saw some sample images. And so there's a lot, for example, of just the legs of giraffes, if they're too close to the camera. But then there are also some, like it, depending on the orientation of the camera and where it's looking and where the animals are going to be located, I would expect that would somewhat influence it. But it would be interesting to know, like, that's a good point, which ones are good. Like this bottom right one here, that's pretty clear. And I would classify that as good. Sorry, bottom left. Yeah. Okay. So in this competition, the organizers gave the participants four data sets, so 4 types of data, and I'll just talk about each of these in turn. One was the actual camera trap images and identifications. One was the results of a detection model that detected where things were in the camera trap, but not specifically. So if there was an animal and where the animal was. One was a data set of images from the iNaturalist database, and one was a set of remote sensing data, so multispectral satellite imagery corresponding to the camera trap locations. So the actual camera trap images were from 12 countries around the world, and each image included an identifier for the camera and sequence information. So if the camera trap was triggered and took multiple images in a row, there was information about which images were part of the same sequence and the order that they were taken in. Importantly, the information did not include the actual location of the camera trap. So it didn't include GPS coordinates, for example. And this is because the Wildlife Conservation Society, who provided the images, was worried about the safety of some of the more sensitive species. So you don't want to put out a bunch of great tiger images and say, like, there's tigers at this latitude and longitude. Like, that's probably not what you want to do if you want to conserve the tiger population and not have poachers go out there and get them. So that was one of the big challenges. And later on, I'll talk about that again. It's one of the things the organizers talked about at the end. So the training set of the camera trap images, there were about 220,000 images from around 450 individual cameras based in these 12 countries. And there were about 270 classes. So a class could be a species name, like they used the Latin name of the species, or it could be like unidentified deer. I think that was one of the classes. There was also like a human class, a misfire class, an empty class, stuff like that. And these class identifiers that were assigned to the images were manually done by the Wildlife Conservation Society biologists. So they're kind of like the right answers or the gold standard for this data set. The biologists also counted the number of animals in the image and provided that information. And one thing that I couldn't figure out is what happened if there were multiple animals of different species in an image, because each image was only associated with one class identifier. So I don't know if this wasn't a problem in the data set or they just chose the most common animal if there was more than one. This I'm not sure about.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. But
nope.
And it goes back to your previous slide. I'm still puzzled about these remote sensing images. What?
Oh, we'll get to those.
Oh, okay. I'll leave it till you get to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Save your questions. It's like 3 more slides. So the camera trap. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say that I've also got a question. So you mentioned that there are different locations between the training and the test set. Obviously, we don't know exactly where the locations were because they don't want you to know. But do you know how much overlap there was between them, like whether they were from entirely different countries, or they were relatively close, like in the same forest but in a different tree.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think that it was different, like everything was in different countries, for example. Like, I don't think it was a large geographic area that was different. So I think they could have been spread in among each other, because the species were a subset of the training classes. So the species in the test set were a subset of the ones in the training set. So if you have like polar bears in the test set, they also need to be in the training set, but they really only cover a given geographic area. So maybe it's a different part of that larger area, but I don't think it's it's not like you take all the desert animals and you put them in the test set. That's not a very satisfactory answer to your question. I know it's a good question.
I mean, it's enough of an answer, I think. Because if they're a subset, then that means that there has to be at least closely related.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, do you know off the top of your head how many classes there were in the test set? Oh, sorry, in the training set that weren't in the test set?
I don't know.
Okay.
I felt like it must have been written somewhere, but I just couldn't find it. The test set, I mean, it was on Kaggle, but I couldn't find anyone who had reported the number of classes that they'd identified in the test set.
That sounds like information they wouldn't have given to the competitors, and maybe they never revealed it.
I mean, they would have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought maybe after the competition or something they would have said, but I didn't see anything about it. Or some people had written blog posts about it, but they didn't. Maybe they didn't want someone to scoop them. I don't know.
There was something else I was going to ask about this, actually.
David, I'm curious. What could you do if you knew that answer? Like, if you knew how many of the species weren't in the test set? I feel like there's almost nothing you can do, even if you know how many there are.
I mean, you could probably, like, if you know that there are some that are going to appear in the training set and not in the test set, you might want to weight the, you could probably guess to a certain extent which ones they were based on the, the probability of seeing them in the training set. Like, there's going to be some class imbalance. So you could potentially train your network to focus more on the more common classes. And focus less on...
But then your network would be really silly for if the most common classes are not in your test data set.
Then you get a really bad score on your public test score, and then you know you've done something wrong. But
if you know there's a good deal of overlap, then you know that there's going to be some like sizable probably representation of them in the test set. I mean, in the training set. Right.
If you knew for sure that there was exactly 100 classes in the test set, or at most, and your answers coming out of your model are telling you there's 110 or 120, you could conceivably fiddle things to take the best 100 out of those, and it might give you an edge if you worked at it hard, and it's an artificial situation, so they didn't want to.
You can also how many submissions do you get? You get 2. For the test set, right? So, like, in principle, you could take 2 different guesses, right, at what's going to be in and what is going to be out.
Is a submission the same as an entry?
No.
No.
You can make 5 submissions a day, and then you can get like your score on some random sample of the test set that you don't know about. That gives you an idea of how well you're doing. But at the very end of the competition, they will only count 2 of your submissions in total that you've made. And so I think David's saying, well,
okay.
But you have to pick those 2. So like
right.
Each competitor will have to pick the 2 submissions that they want scored.
Right.
And then David said, yeah, I think you're right, David. You can make wildly different guesses on each of those submissions and hope that you get it. I think what you're saying, Bruce, I think you're right. Like, if they did do that, the winner would be determined by who optimized this small factor of the competition the best. And I don't think that's.
I mean, I don't think you would get very much benefit from it, but you might get enough of a benefit to edge out your competitors if you're already at the top.
Mhm.
Okay, any more questions? So I think we've covered the test set and that they're different locations from their training set locations. So the organizers then put all the images in from the camera trap data set through a detector called megadetector. And then they provided the detection results to the competitors. So megadetector is produced by a team from Microsoft AI for Earth. It's a division of Microsoft that works on using AI to solve environmental or like Earth related problems. There's like a water quality division. And there's this one, which is specifically for camera traps. And they work with some organizations as well to get their algorithms out there in use in the wider community. So they designed megadetector to be a generic detector for camera trap images, which means it takes in a camera trap image and then it puts out detections, which are either no detections at all, meaning that the image is empty, or detections labeled as an animal or as a human. And the animal and human detections have a probability associated with them. So like you can't really see, but for these pigs in the picture, it's like animal probability 0.999 associated with that. They based megadetector on faster RCNN, and there's Inception ResNet included in there, and they trained it with TensorFlow, but none of that really matters for the purposes of our discussion unless you're interested in it. So the organizers provided these outputs, so the bounding boxes, to the participants. They didn't provide like the cropped images to the detections, but just the list of detections for each of the images. If you're interested in megadetector, it is pretty cool. I put some links at the bottom once the slides are up for more information. And there's a really cool video where they like follow around some animals with bounding boxes. If you like videos of animals, you could check that out. Oh, any questions on megadetector? Right. So the third data set that the participants got was a data set of images from iNaturalist. So iNaturalist is an online citizen science platform, and they also have an app where people around the world can take pictures of animals and upload them and identify them or ask for help identifying them. It has quite a lot of images in it. And importantly for this competition, the iNaturalist images are often much better quality than the camera trap images. So there's a comparison down here of the same species with some camera trap images from the species on the left and the iNaturalist ones on the right, because people are trying to take, you know, a nice picture of the bird that's well lit and the bird's in the middle and you can see the whole thing. It's not always the case that the iNaturalist images are better. There are even some camera trap images in there. And sometimes the camera trap data set images are better than iNaturalist, but in general, they're quite good. And so the organizers thought that using this information might help to train a more accurate model. So they had some data sets already, because at the same conference and the same workshop, they had run Kaggle competitions on iNaturalist in 2017, 18, and 19. So the organizers of this competition curated the 2017 and 2018 data sets to include only the species that were seen in the camera trap data. And they gave them the same class IDs that were seen in the camera trap data. The 2019 iNaturalist set didn't actually have any species overlap, but they still provided it just in case it was useful. And each of the iNaturalist images came along with a location, a latitude and longitude, a date it was taken, the user that took the image, and the class ID which matched the camera trap class ID. Right. So the fourth data set participants got was multispectral satellite images from the Landsat 8 satellite. So this is a satellite put up by NASA and the US Geological Survey. It takes images in different wavelength bands. So this picture at the top here is wavelength on the x-axis, and then the colored dots or rectangles are just the different bands that the satellite takes images at. The exact information is not that important, but in case anyone's into wavelengths, I put it there. These different wavelengths reflect different features of the Earth. So one specialized, like band 1 is specialized for coastal, for like deep ocean colors. There's a regular red, green, blue. There's an infrared band and one specialized for clouds. And then there's also some auto-generated metadata for each pixel. So whether it contains a cloud or a cloud shadow or it's over water. And so the organizers of the competition thought that having this sort of geographical data, so each camera location was associated with a set of satellite images. So having this geographic information about the camera location, even though you didn't have the actual GPS coordinates, might be helpful to figure out, if a species only lives in the forest, then you're not going to be identifying it in an image where the satellite data shows that it's the desert, something like that. So this was their hope. Reese, did that answer any of your questions about the satellite?
Yeah, that does make sense. So you got a little bit of coarse location information then for the animal pictures, just not precise. Like, how would you relate an animal picture to a remote sensing picture?
Well, they were related in the data set, but not with GPS coordinates. So you knew which satellite images went with which camera. Oh, and the satellite images were also not centered over the camera location. They obfuscated the coordinates a little bit. So you couldn't, even if you could identify this mountain range, you weren't really sure where exactly the camera was.
Okay. Yep, that makes sense.
So this was sort of their proxy for location, I guess, in a way.
Any idea what the scale is on those images? Like how many?
Yeah, so each image was 6 kilometers by 6 kilometers. And each pixel was 30 by 30 meters or 30 square meters?
It's 30 by 30 meters. I used to work with this data. Yeah, it's 30 by 30.
Cool. Okay, it's 30 by 30. And then this one layer, the panchromatic layer, that's higher resolution. It's 15 by 15 meters. Okay. So there were these 4 types of data that the participants got. So I'll just talk a little bit about what that data looked like. So the exploratory data analysis, or EDA, for the camera trap images. So this first graph, so the number of animals per image is on the x-axis, and then the number of images with that number of animals in it is on the y-axis. So usually there's either no animal in an image or only one animal in an image. So that's this first bar. But a few images had up to 80 animals in them. And I think that was a herd of cows, that one with 80. Each location, and sorry, I don't know how to get rid of this toolbar that pops up when my mouse goes down here, so I'll maybe just not point at it.
I've got a tamper monkey script for that. I should have given it to you.
Oh, yeah, sounds great. Okay, so the bottom graph, which I'm not going to point at, shows the number of images at a single location on the x-axis, and then the number of locations that had that number of images associated with them on the y-axis. So most locations only had a few images taken at them. So there's that, maybe I can get my mouse down here. There's this tall green bar here, and then a few locations had up to almost 9,000 images at them. Most locations had about 670 or so. Then the images had been labeled by the Wildlife Conservation Society biologists. So they all had a class ID, or essentially a species ID associated with them. So these are the top 20 species IDs. So the top 20 most common species. And then the number of images identified as that species. So the most images, well, the most common class was empty. The next most common class was human. And then there are some birds and some animals. And then like the 19th most common was motorcycle. So yeah, it was also very unbalanced. Like it had a very long tail.
So
those, oh yeah?
I'm just noticing the number that appear empty there is, it's coming in at like about 70,000, which is like a third of the data set, if I remember correctly. You mentioned before that somewhere around 70% of them usually end up being empty. So they specifically curated to have a higher fraction of animals in the data set.
Yeah, they may have, or the place where I heard the 70%, maybe that was from a different person's experience, that maybe they just had really bad luck with their camera trap. But yeah, it also was different. I noticed that as well, that normally you might expect more empty ones. So they may very well have curated it. I mean, they had to curate it in some way. So these camera trap images were run through megadetector to detect whether the image was empty or had a human in it or an animal in it. And these results agreed with the biologist identifications, which is a good thing. So about a third of the images were empty, about 12% had humans in them, and then the remaining 60% had an animal. So if you take the camera trap images and their identification, so this line, this is from someone online, they did the exploration, and so this is really a histogram. It's not actually a line, so just think of it as a histogram. So each class ID is on the bottom, so that's each species essentially, and then the number of images of that species is on the y-axis, and it's a log scale. So this just helps to squash that really long tail distribution into something you can see better. So you can see, I mean, you could even see more if it wasn't log scale, but it is really not balanced. And then the iNaturalist data set also is imbalanced. There are fewer classes there. So this is the same idea. The iNaturalist species is on the x-axis and then the number of images on the y. So there are fewer classes, and it does have a similar sort of imbalanced distribution. So now what you can do is you sort of add together the camera trap and the iNaturalist information and then make a distribution of the result. So this is ordered by camera trap class ID on the bottom, and then the total number of images in the combined data set on the y-axis. So if this line is very different from the camera trap line, that means that there are more iNaturalist images for that species. Okay, so that's all the EDA. Does anyone have any questions before we move on?
I have a question about the mega detector. You mentioned that the mega detector, it aligned with the human annotations. Was that perfect? Like, is it like really 100% accurate?
I really wanted to test that question because I downloaded all the annotations and I didn't have time to get the actual numbers. And the people who did these EDAs, they didn't report, like these were different people and they didn't report the corresponding numbers. So I don't know if it aligned perfectly. Yeah, but that's actually a great lead into the next slide. Thank you for that. Unless anyone else has questions about. So once the participants started analyzing the data, they found some problems with it, specifically with some of the annotations. So, okay, so first, some of the images were corrupted in the training set and the test set. Something with the JPEG information wasn't working right, and the images couldn't be read. So those images ended up being dropped from the training and the test set. And then relevant to what you were saying, Hendrik, some of the labels were noisy. So there were some sequences, those series of images taken one after another, that were labeled as sequences, but they were like 10,000 unrelated images in the sequence. And so the participants ended up just disregarding the provided sequence information and then regenerating the sequences on their own based on the camera ID and the timing of the images. And then some participants found that the counts from the biologists didn't always match the megadetector results. So this wasn't necessarily the overall identification, the class of the image, but the number of animals in the image didn't match. So in this example, the biologist said there were 9 animals, but megadetector said there were 7. And the participant was like, I can't find 2 more animals. Like, either they're not there or, they're very well hidden. So there was some noise in the annotations that participants had to deal with.
I think I see a bird in the tree.
Yeah, I know, right? I don't know why the bird isn't labeled. Okay, so there were 121 teams that entered the competition. they were evaluated on top 1 categorization accuracy. So that's their score over here. So all that is the percentage of correct identification. So each image was associated with one identification or class ID or species or whatever you want to call it. So for each image, they submitted one identification, and the percentage of those identifications that was correct was their score. They didn't have to give a probability associated with their identification. One thing that I noticed was that the more successful teams had many more entries. As you went down the leaderboard, it got fewer and fewer. So if you do want to enter a Kaggle competition, I think you should do a lot of entries, get more chance of winning. The organizers asked that the top 10 teams submit like a description of their solutions and their approach. Only the top 4 and then the 8th place did this on Kaggle. So I'm not sure how the other ones submitted their solution or their description, or maybe they didn't. But the top 4 submitted quite good descriptions of what they did. And so as someone sort of starting out in this area, for me, it's interesting to compare the approaches that these different teams took and how this might have affected their score. So like the top 2 teams, they're only different by 0.4% of correct identifications, but they had some differences in their approaches. And then there's a pretty big gap between them and the 3rd and 4th place teams. So for the next part of the talk, I'm kind of going to take those 4 teams' approaches and organize them so that we can compare them. So there are 4 columns from 1st place, 2nd place, 3rd place to 4th place, from right to left. And then I divided it up into stages of the modeling approach so that we can compare the approaches that they used. So if you have any insight
just before you,
yeah.
Just before you jump into that, if you could go back to the last slide for a second, as someone who's seen a lot of Kaggle competitions, the top 1 categorization accuracy of 90% seems amazingly good. If these people hadn't published their solutions, I would be suspicious. They're so good. And also the fact that when you get past the first 2, you drop from like a 90% to an 85%. That's a big gap. Often it's really crowded at the top of the leaderboard, and you're not seeing a difference until you get to like the 4th or 5th decimal place sometimes. So yeah, you almost wonder if like either they're doing something dramatically different or they found a data leak or something. So anyway, that's just an observation.
And I'm glad that you brought me back to this slide, Bruce, because one of the things I thought was really cool. So the 1st and 3rd place, they're like groups of people. 2nd place guy works at Facebook, and 4th place guy is a PhD student from Brazil. And the organizer of the whole competition is a PhD student from Caltech who used to be a professional ballerina. And so something that's so interesting to me is like the diversity of backgrounds involved in this. It's really cool. Okay, so comparing the 1st to 4th place solutions, I've put them at the top and their scores. So the data that they used, all 4 teams used the crops from Megadetector. The 1st and 2nd place used Megadetector version 4, whereas the 3rd and 4th used the provided Megadetector 3 crops. And so the 1st and 2nd place teams especially noted that using the Megadetector 4 results gave them much better accuracy than using version 3. And version 4 came out, I think, sometime between when they were preparing the competition and the closing date. So it's just trained on more data and it's more accurate. 1st and 2nd place teams also curated the Megadetector crops or the detections to take only the ones with higher confidences. And 3rd and 4th place teams didn't mention that they had done that. So when I say crops, I mean like they cut the image around the detection of the animal and then treated that as a single image. They didn't use the whole original camera trap image. And also I noticed that it's 7:30, so I don't know if that's like the end. I'm happy to keep going, but if you have anything before, if people do need to leave.
I think we're booked to 8, right?
We go till 8.
Okay.
Yeah, you
Cool.
got
Fine.
time.
Right, so Megadetector 4 seemed to be helpful. 2nd to 4th place teams then resized those Megadetector crops into squares. Some of them specified what they did for padding or image boundaries if that square would make the crop go outside of the image. The third place team didn't talk about that. The first place team was the only one to use the full images in addition to the crops from Megadetector. So they trained their models on both, on the crops and the full original camera trap images. The first and second place teams had these strategies to increase the generalization of their models because they knew that the test set was going to be from different locations. So the first place team added an additional classifier for location proxy, so camera ID essentially. They duplicated camera ID and then ran that additional classifier through a gradient reversal layer in order to help their model learn more features that generalized more across the different locations. The second place team, their method of helping their model to generalize more was to remove the human and the noisy classes, but then they kept the empty ones in order to reduce the activation of their model on the background. The second place team also, well, team, it was one guy, but he included some other custom variables. So he took he expressed the time of year and time of day as a cosine or a sine relationship. And then he also noted the size and location of the crop in the frame. So he thought that maybe if the crop was lower down or higher up might relate to the type of animal that was in the frame, or yeah, he also did left to right, but I don't know what he hoped to get out of that. He was also the only guy to use the iNaturalist data, and nobody used the satellite data in the top 4. So that was a pretty big surprise that they didn't end up using that. And the fourth place team was the only one to discuss their validation set. One of the other teams did mention something about validating, but they didn't talk about their specific validation set. There was some mention at some point that maybe this competition, it wasn't as important to have a validation set because you were going to be generalizing your model to new locations anyway that it hadn't been trained on. So maybe that was less important. But from my understanding, it's quite common to use a validation set. So I'm not sure if maybe they didn't describe it or maybe they just found that it wasn't useful.
I wonder if that's telling or not. I mean, I'm kind of surprised they didn't discuss it because I'd have thought here, especially given the nature of the test set, the validation set, how they constructed it would be quite important. Because you don't want to just, I guess you don't want to just do a random selection, right? You want to make sure that you're creating a validation set that looks as similar to the test set as possible so that you're not overly confident in what your model's doing. Anyway, yeah, it's interesting why they would leave that out because I'd have thought that would be one of the sort of secret keys to doing well here.
The fourth place guy did discuss in detail how he put a lot of thought into his validation set. So he did exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
Too bad he used Megadetector version 3.
I know, right?
I'm curious. I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but one of the presenters we had earlier this year, Kiri, she presented a talk on how you create validation and training sets, especially in the context when certain images are very similar to each other. You don't necessarily want those images to be spread across training and validation because then the model might be learning something specific to that image that's not actually relevant to the generalizability of it. I wonder how much of an issue that was here, because if there is a camera trap and there's just one animal that's in the frame for a while, like there might be multiple images of that one animal taken. Did anybody discuss anything like that?
No, the fourth place guy might have taken that into account, but that animal, yeah, would then show up in that sequence of images, and they did have sequence ID in their parameters, okay. So it may have come out in that. And then at the end, the teams did group those images from one sequence and then assign a similar ID to all those images. So they did take it into account that way.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, cool.
Okay. So the different teams, like second to fourth place teams, used data augmentation. First place didn't mention anything about data augmentation, and the other teams did some quite different things. The third place team said that they tried a bunch of methods, but they just ended up with a histogram equalization and horizontal flip. At the end, the organizers noted that the data augmentation didn't seem to have a big effect on the accuracy of the model. And they were pretty surprised by that. And I'm not really sure why that was, but one reason might be because the camera trap data was just so diverse anyway. Some of it was infrared, some of it was in color, it was in different environments. Maybe the animals were at different zoom levels. So maybe this adding extra images with like essentially noise using augmentation didn't make that big of a difference. I'm not sure, but that was really interesting to them. So that long-tailed species distribution or class distribution, where some species were represented a lot and some weren't, often you will account for that by resampling the training set. And so the first place and the third place teams did that. Both of them had some sort of sampling based on an inverse, the inverse of how common the class was. And then the first place team to that added a uniform sampling set and then mixed those two sets together. The second place and fourth place teams didn't say anything about adjusting for class distribution. And the organizers at the end noted that it didn't seem to matter whether or not people or how people adjusted for class distribution. There was this one paper which some people tried. It's a different method to calculate the class weights, but it didn't really seem to make a big difference. So you could just use it the way it was, I guess. Right. So the different networks that the teams used, the first to third place teams all used versions of EfficientNet, and then the first and third place combined EfficientNet with other models. Fourth place used Inception. I guess they didn't like EfficientNet, but EfficientNet seemed pretty popular. And so here's where I'm going to take a small detour to talk about EfficientNet, because it's a pretty cool way of making a network. So the people who made EfficientNet, I think they worked for Google. Their idea was to systematically search network architectures in order to optimize for accuracy and for resources measured as flops or floating point operations per second. So they wanted to get an accurate network with the lowest amount of resources possible. And they based this off of a previous paper that they wrote where they found MNASNet, which is essentially the same thing, except instead of optimizing for accuracy and resources, they optimized for accuracy and speed, measured as the time that it took the model to run on a cell phone, because they were interested in finding these networks that could be run quickly on cell phones and other mobile devices. So the way that they systematically searched for this optimal architecture is they took, so this is like the input image on the left, and then it goes through all of these blocks to the output on the right. And each of the blocks has a given number of layers in it. The number of layers is variable, and each layer is composed of some combination of different operations here in blue. And so they did this systematic search through the different operations and the different layer properties in order to optimize it. So they had this controller who would sample a model from that search space. So it would come up with a given combination of operations for each of the layers. It would send that model out. The trainer would train the model and evaluate the accuracy, and also send, in the case of MNASNet, it would send the model to a phone where it would measure the latency or the time that it took that model to run. And then those two optimization parameters were put into an objective function to compute how good that model was. And that the result of that function was sent back to the controller, who then resampled these blue models here to come up with a new model, sent it to the trainer, the whole thing repeated again until you iterated to get an architecture that was accurate with either in the case of MNESnet, a short latency, or in the case of EfficientNet, a low number of resources or plots. Any questions about that?
Sorry, how much control did the controller have over the architecture? You mentioned they could switch out, like you talk about switching out different types of blocks and different number of layers. Were they also able to increase or decrease the number of blocks?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure about that because EfficientNet and MNESnet both seem to have 7 blocks. So either there was a reason for that, or that's what the controller came up with. I forgot to read that part of the paper, I think was the problem there. So in this way, the researchers came up with EfficientNet, which had a good accuracy for not many resources. And they don't have one of those nice block diagrams of it, but they do have this nice table. So here are the stages. I think those correspond to the blocks in the last slide. So there are 7 in the middle, and then an initial one and a final one. And then this is what happens inside each of those blocks, and the input resolution of into the block, and the output number of channels and the number of layers in the block. So this is like their base network, which they called EfficientNet V0. They found 2 main things were important. One is the use of this MBCon block, which is a mobile inverted bottleneck convolution. So in a lot of networks, what happens is the number of channels gets decreased in this bottleneck, and then some things happen, some convolutions, and then it gets increased again. But in an inverted bottleneck, the opposite happens. You increase the number of channels, and then you perform a depthwise convolution, and then you decrease the number of channels again. And this depthwise convolution step, it uses fewer parameters, and it's faster than if you do a regular bottleneck. And so it's much more efficient in some ways, in the ways that these people care about, to use this inverted bottleneck instead of a regular, where you narrow down the layers and then expand them. The second thing they found was important was to this squeeze and excitation optimization, or SE block. And so what this does is it is a way to generalize across the channel. So each channel gets squashed down into a single value. So you have a vector essentially of one value for each channel. And then the importance of each of those channels is evaluated, and you come up with a weight for that channel, which you then expand back again and then continue on your way. And so this is a way to incorporate more generalization into the network, which especially for this this camera trap competition was probably very important. So that's how they came up with this architecture for EfficientNet. Any questions? So
actually, sorry, I just have just a general observation on kind of where machine learning has been headed over these past few years, and I think this is maybe some scary slides to look at for a lot of new people here. But I think typically a lot of the competitors in this competition didn't need to know didn't need to be able to build this themselves. Like a lot of this stuff, these are just like open source Python libraries, and you just need to be able to manage the input and the output of like the labels and the images. And this is something that's happening. This has been happening to images for a while now, or for machine learning on images. It's also happening on language and NLP. And I know personally myself, the work that I'm doing at Boeing, looking at NLP, it's really just about using these pre-built libraries and about just like managing the input and the output. Like all of this hard work is like almost done for you these days. It's a weird state, like how machine learning has developed over the last few years. So I just kind of wanted to point that out in case.
Yeah, you can do some pretty amazing machine learning stuff if you're just a script kiddie, basically, is what it comes down to. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much stuff out there that's available that's you can just treat it as a black box. Mm-hmm. And images, NLP is like that. Not so much speech and audio, but there's small steps in that direction.
Actually, this picture of the bottleneck, that's from an audio paper.
Okay.
The only one that I read for this. And one of the things that I noticed too is that this EfficientNet, it came out kind of 2019, 2020. So I feel like one of the things in machine learning is there's always like an in network. And for a while it was ResNet. And I guess during this competition it was EfficientNet. And that's one reason why so many people used it. It was like the new kid on the block and it was exciting. And
that is the story of Kaggle competitions. That's the story of Kaggle competitions. One of the fun things about them is you get to see what the flavor of the month is because everyone jumps on the most popular technique that month.
Yeah, I do like the way they designed it though. It appeals to my like systematic scientist nature. Okay, so top 3 teams used EfficientNet, and then the first and second place teams specified. So you see like EfficientNet B6 or B4. So the EfficientNet people, they did another thing around the same time they were making EfficientNet, is they figured out a good way to scale networks. So if you have a network like this one that's shown on the bottom left, it has a given number of layers and number of channels per layer and a resolution of the input into each layer. And you can scale up that network to have higher resolution, or maybe I should go in order. You can scale it to be wider, so each layer is wider. You can scale it to be deeper, so there are more layers, or you can increase the resolution of each layer. And all of these things will, in theory, increase the accuracy of your network. But if you try to increase accuracy by just scaling one of them, eventually you reach diminishing returns. Like you scale it up, whatever, you double it again, but you don't get double the accuracy back from that. And so these researchers decided to try scaling width, depth, and resolution all proportional to each other. So they all increase at once in a coordinated way. And they figured that this would give you better or similar accuracy, but you'd need fewer parameters and fewer resources in order to do that. And it kind of makes sense. Like if you have a higher resolution input image, you would hopefully need like a deeper and a wider network in order to get the same fine-grained detections out of that higher resolution input. So
that's an interesting deep hypothesis. Did they actually test that out to any extent?
Stay tuned. Okay. So they did this systematically. And so for their EfficientNet B0, so their base network they found, if you scale by only the width, the depth, or the resolution, you follow these green, yellow, and blue lines. So this graph shows floating point operations on the bottom. So how many operations are involved in running the network in billions. I mean, there's tons of them. And then the accuracy is on the y-axis. So you want to have fewer operations, so be towards the left, and highly accurate, so be towards the top. So you'd like to be further up here. So if you scale only with depth or resolution, you follow these lines. But if you kind of scale them all together in a coordinated way, you end up following the red line. So you're much more accurate for a given number of plots. This is a good thing. And then the dots are just like different scaling parameters. So it gets bigger and bigger. So they did not only do this with EfficientNet, but they compared this scaling of EfficientNet to other networks. And they did scale all these other networks too. And they have some data in the paper about that, but I just didn't show it here. So the red line is EfficientNet, and these two graphs are similar. You want to be high and to the left. The left graph on the x-axis is the number of parameters, and the right-hand graph has plots on the bottom, and then accuracy on both is towards the top. So they found that if you scale, in this case, EfficientNet in this coordinated way, you can get a more accurate network that's smaller, it has fewer parameters, and it uses fewer resources than other popular neural networks that are out there right now. One thing that really blew my mind with this is down here in the left-hand graph, they show data for G-pipe. I don't know, I've never heard of G-pipe, but anyway, it's giant. It has 556 million parameters. So that would make it like off of the screen if you put it on this graph, which is why it's not shown. And EfficientNet B7 gets the same accuracy as this massive G-pipe with 60 million parameters. And GPipe is so big, they needed to make a special parallelization library in order to run it. So to get the same amount of accuracy with so many fewer parameters is pretty incredible. Okay, this is the last EfficientNet slide. So if anyone has any final questions about it. So EfficientNet was popular. The first place team in the iWildCam competition used this gradient reversal layer with their additional camera ID classifier to be able to generalize more across locations. And then they also trained 2 full versions of each of their models. So they had an EfficientNet V6 model and another version of ResNet, an iteration of that. And they trained each of those on the full camera trap image as well as on the crop of the image with the highest confidence, and then assigned the image a final score, a weighted score of the full and the crop identifications. Okay. And then I'm going to go a little faster because we're running out of time. The final class determination. So the first 2 teams specified how they combined the predictions for all of the crops, so the identified animals within an image. So they had systematic ways of doing that. I'm not sure what the 3rd and 4th place teams did. They didn't really say, but all the teams, and I forget who asked about this, but someone did. They had methods to recluster the images, grouping them by camera ID, so by location, and by time. For example, like 4th place had a threshold of within 30 minutes. If 2 images were taken within 30 minutes of each other, they were considered in the same cluster, the same sequence. And then within that sequence, they averaged the predictions and assigned that final top prediction to all of the images in that sequence. So any other questions about the 4 teams method? Okay. So the organizers of the competition, so this is one benefit for us, is that this conference was held during, it was June or July 2020, so during COVID. So they did it all on Zoom. And they put some recordings up of their discussions, and they're really interesting to listen to. So I've put a link up here to one of the final discussions, and it was with one of the organizers of the competition and representatives from teams 1 and 3. And they were discussing some of the things that they learned through the competition. So the organizers noticed that most or all of the teams in the top 10 places used contextual information to improve their scores, like sequence information was a really big one, the location, the time of day, the time of year. They also used the crops from Megadetector and transfer learning. So their models started out by training on ImageNet or iNaturalist. Things that helped the most was sequence information. Teams found that gave them a 5 or 10% increase in accuracy by taking that into account and by fixing the incorrect sequence information that they were provided. Using Megadetector 4 instead of 3 helped a lot. Megadetector 4 did have a big increase in accuracy, and using methods that generalized across locations helped because, I mean, your model needs to generalize to new locations in the end, so that makes sense. Things that didn't help. Using those extra image types, like the satellite data or the iNaturalist data, didn't seem to make a difference at all. And the organizers were really sad about that. Like, they were really hoping using satellite data would give some huge insights or something, but it didn't. Data augmentation didn't seem to matter, and neither did class balancing techniques, which is different from a lot of other problems where they're very important. So one exception to the image modalities, there was one team that did a really good article on their approach, and they found that using the satellite data was important for them to distinguish between species that looked similar but lived in different environments. So the mountain lion and the lion look pretty similar, but the mountain lion lives in like forested mountains, and the lion lives on the savanna, and they had no misclassifications between these 2 categories by taking into account the satellite information. So I'm not sure if they were assigning importance to the satellite information that like all the other people were getting without that. Like maybe there are some species differences there that you just can't tell as a human, or maybe the other teams just needed to be more creative with how they used it. I'm not sure. So for future competitions, the organizers and some suggestions from the participants would like to include some kind of location, even if it's just a country level identification. They think that would help a lot in more accurately identifying the species. Using maybe satellite data wasn't a good kind of data to include, but maybe there is some other additional data that could increase accuracy. They talked about including other tasks like detecting the animals as well, instead of relying on megadetector, or segmenting the animals, so like outlining them instead of just having a box. And one really interesting one was to have constraints on the models, like to make it partly a kernel competition. So to have constraints on size or latency of the model, so that you would be able to run them remotely on a camera trap and then have real-time identification of what that camera trap was seeing. And one application of this, which is in use now, is to detect poachers. So they have camera traps that run these algorithms to identify people or vehicles in wildlife parks. And then when they identify those, they send, they can send a message, or maybe there are park rangers who are looking at the identifications in real time, and then they can go out and prevent the poachers from killing more animals. So that's all. I know it's 8 already, exactly. These are just some more resources if you do see the slides online and you wanted to learn some more and visit these cool sites. So I guess if you have more questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
I have a quick question. It's just with respect to how you were saying data augmentation and the class balancing didn't seem to work as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if that's because, like, do you know if the final set they were judged on was relatively the same proportions? Because if both of those are in the long tail, the people that did well maybe didn't care. Maybe they're just really good at classifying empty images.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I think what would be interesting from from their point of view, I guess, or something interesting to consider would be, how good is it at classifying just animal images?
Mm-hmm. Well, they did get 90% accuracy, and there were, I guess I don't know the percentage of animal and non-animal in the test set. Yeah. But yeah, it's very possible.
I've got a question too, Heather. I know we were talking before, and you mentioned that the winners did not post any of their notebooks, so we can't see exactly what the code that they ran. But did you see any public notebooks that actually like loaded up EfficientNet and used that to do any predictions? I'd be curious if we could reference that.
I didn't see that, but I will look, and if I find any, I'll put it in those links at the end. I did see some notebooks that did EDA and a description of people's pipeline that did the whole thing. They wrote quite an extensive article. Their notebooks might be on GitHub, but I didn't go that far into it. Yeah, okay. Good question.
Thanks.
I might have like a probably more general Kaggle question. So there were like people were giving these specific data sets to train on and use in their algorithms. I assume they weren't allowed to just like find other data sets and use it to train on them. Mm-hmm. Okay, but at the same time, like you mentioned, like transfer learning, like that, people did pre-train on ImageNet. And was ImageNet explicitly allowed for this?
I believe you could use pre-trained models, but you couldn't get extra data yourself for this competition. So if there was a model that was pre-trained on ImageNet, you could use it, but you could not go out and collect extra camera trap images to train on. So I think there was a distinction there between like the data that you were training on and the model that was trained. But I think also different competitions are different in that way, if you were asking a general type of competition.
Okay, so if somebody else had trained on a different data set, pre-trained, then I could use their model with. with the weights that were trained on like
so.
different.
Yeah. If you were entering this competition, I would read the rules in much more detail. But I believe for this competition, you could do that. Yeah.
Okay, we are hitting the 8:03 mark. So that's kind of our allotted time, but you're definitely welcome to stay and ask Heather more questions if Heather's still here. But this will be kind of the end of our session. I do want to invite everyone to join me in a round of applause for Heather on 3. So 1, 2, 3. Thank you, Heather, for such an amazing competition and presentation.
Thanks for sticking around.